It is December 5th, 1941. The temperature on the outskirts of Moscow plummets to 40 degrees below zero. At the forward positions of the 258th Infantry Regiment of the Wehrmacht, just 27 kilometers from the Kremlin, German soldiers can see, through binoculars, the golden domes of Moscow's cathedrals glittering under the pale sun of the Russian winter. They are the closest men to the Soviet capital that the Third Reich will ever position. But none of them knows that, at that very moment, 77 fresh Soviet divisions, invisible to German intelligence, are about to crash down upon their lines like an avalanche of steel. The following morning, the glacial silence is shattered by the thunder of thousands of artillery pieces. The Soviet counteroffensive erupts along a front stretching more than 1,000 kilometers. Men who hours before had dreamed of Moscow's fall now fight only to survive. So how was the greatest war machine the world had ever known, the Wehrmacht of 1941, undefeated in every theater, defeated at the gates of Stalin's capital? Was it the cold that beat the Germans, as the popular myth would have it? Or does the answer lie in something far deeper? A fatal combination of strategic arrogance, intelligence failures, underestimation of the enemy, and the almost superhuman resilience of a people fighting for their very survival? This is the story of the Battle of Moscow, the first great defeat of Nazi Germany, the moment when the myth of Blitzkrieg's invincibility is shattered, and the turning point that, for many historians, seals the fate of the Second World War. Part 2. Barbarossa. Hitler's Supreme Gamble. To understand Moscow, we must go back to the beginning. It is June 22, 1941, at 3:15 in the morning when 3,200,000 German soldiers crossed the Soviet border in the largest military operation in human history, Operation Barbarossa. The scale defies the imagination. The Wehrmacht deploys 3,350 tanks, 7,146 artillery pieces, 2,770 aircraft, and 600,000 motorized vehicles along a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, a line of nearly 2,900 kilometers. It is the equivalent of the distance from Lisbon to Moscow. 3 army groups advanced simultaneously: Army Group North, under Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, heading toward Leningrad; Army Group South, under Gerd von Rundstedt, moving toward Ukraine and the Caucasus; and Army Group Center, under Fedor von Bock, with the most ambitious final objective of all: Moscow. The plan is bold in its simplicity and monstrous in its assumptions. Hitler and the Wehrmacht High Command, the OKW, estimate that the Soviet Union will collapse within 8 to 10 weeks. The Red Army, decimated by Stalin's great purges between 1937 and 1938, which eliminated 3 of the 5 Soviet marshals, 13 of the 15 army commanders, 50 of the 57 corps commanders, and 154 of the 186 division commanders, is considered a giant with feet of clay. Hitler himself declares with contempt, "We only have to kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." Adolf Hitler, June 1941, as reported by Alfred Jodl. In the first weeks, reality seems to confirm the prophecy. The panzers advance at dizzying speed. In the first 5 days, Panzer Group 3 under General Hermann Hoth and Panzer Group 2 under Heinz Guderian, the father of armored warfare, execute a monumental encirclement around Minsk, capturing 324,000 Soviet soldiers, 3,300 tanks, and 1,800 artillery pieces. It is one of the largest encirclement battles in history, and it happens before the end of the first week. But already here, hidden within the entrails of victory, lie the first warning signs. Colonel General Franz Halder, Chief of the Army General Staff, the OKH, writes in his war diary on August 11, 1941, "At the beginning of the war, we counted on approximately 200 enemy divisions. We have already identified 360. When a dozen of these divisions are destroyed, the Russians put another dozen in their place." Franz Halder, War Diary, August 11, 1941. It is the first admission, still whispered in command circles, that German intelligence has catastrophically underestimated the Soviet capacity for military regeneration. The USSR With its population of 196 million inhabitants, compared to 80 million in Germany, possesses human reserves that seem inexhaustible. Part 3. The Fatal Cross. Rhodes, Kyiv or Moscow. It is here that the narrative reaches its first dramatic turning point. In August 1941, Army Group Center is 350 kilometers from Moscow. Guderian, Hoth, and Bach push furiously for a direct advance on the capital. Guderian argues that the panzers still have momentum, that the Red Army on the Central Front is disorganized, that the window to take Moscow before winter closes with each passing day. But Hitler thinks differently. The Führer looks at the map and sees Ukraine, the breadbasket of the USSR, with its vast wheat reserves, its manganese and coal mines, and its industrial complex in the Donbass. To the south, Rundstedt's army group faces fierce resistance. The Soviet forces of Marshal Semyon Budyonny, though poorly coordinated, threaten the southern flank of Army Group Center. Hitler orders Guderian to divert his 2nd Panzer Group southward in support of the offensive against Kiev. It is one of the most controversial decisions of the war. Guderian flies personally to Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia, the Wolf's Lair, to protest. The general appeals with passion. My Führer, Moscow, is not merely the capital and the seat of the Soviet government. It is the country's largest railway hub. Taking Moscow means cutting Russia's north-south lines of communication. The enemy cannot compensate for this loss. Heinz Guderian, Memoirs, Panzerleader Hitler refuses. Kiev will be the target. And, from a purely tactical standpoint, the Battle of Kiev, which concludes on September 26th, is a spectacular victory. 665,000 Soviet soldiers captured, the largest encirclement in military history. But the cost is time. 5 precious weeks consumed. 5 weeks during which the Russian autumn begins to transform the roads into rivers of mud. 5 weeks that, as will be proven, are the difference between victory and defeat before Moscow. The British military historian John Keegan will summarize decades later, Kiev was Germany's greatest tactical victory and greatest strategic error of the war. John Keegan, The Second World War, Part 4. Operation Typhoon. The March on Moscow. It is October 2, 1941, when Operation Typhoon, Unternehmen Typhoon, is finally launched. Army Group Center, now reinforced with units from the north and south, constitutes the greatest concentration of force of the war up to that point. 1,929,406 soldiers, 14,000 artillery pieces, 1,000 tanks, and 1,390 aircraft of Luftflotte II, under the command of Field Marshal Albert Kesselring. The force is organized into 3 attack wedges. To the north, the 9th Army of General Adolf Strauss and Hoth's 3rd Panzer Group. In the center, the 4th Army of Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge. To the south, Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group and the 2nd Army of General Maximilian von Weichs. The objective, to encircle and destroy the Soviet forces in the Vyazma and Bryansk region, open the road to Moscow, and capture the capital before winter. On the Soviet side, the situation is desperate. The 3 fronts defending the approaches to Moscow: the Western Front under General Ivan Konev, the Reserve Front under Marshal Semyon Budyonny, and the Bryansk Front under General Andrei Yeryomenko. Total approximately 1,250,000 men, 990 tanks, and 667 aircraft. These are significant numbers, but the quality and experience of the troops are below those of the Wehrmacht. Many divisions were hastily formed with poorly trained reservists. The chain of command, still traumatized by the Stalinist purges, suffers from rigidity and a fear of taking initiative. The initial blow is devastating. In just 10 days, the German armored pincers execute 2 monumental encirclements. At Vyazma, Panzer Groups 3 and 4 close a ring around 4 Soviet armies, trapping approximately 500,000 soldiers. At Bryansk, Guderian carries out another encirclement, capturing 50,000 and dispersing many more. In total, Soviet losses in the 2 cauldrons known as Kessel amount to approximately 673,000 prisoners, 1,242 tanks, and 5,412 artillery pieces destroyed or captured. In Berlin, euphoria is total. On October 9th, the Reich press spokesman, Otto Dietrich, makes a statement to the press that will go down in history as one of the war's greatest miscalculations. For all military purposes, Soviet Russia is finished. Otto Dietrich, press conference, Berlin, October 9th, 1941. But while diplomats toast and newspapers print triumphant headlines, something is happening on the roads leading to Moscow, something that no German planner calculated with sufficient seriousness. Part 5. GE Neuromud. The Rasputitsa. It is mid-October, and the Rasputitsa, the autumn rainy season that transforms the Russian soil into an ocean of mud, strikes Army Group Center with apocalyptic force. Russian roads, in their overwhelming majority, are unpaved. Of the approximately 1.5 million kilometers of roads in the USSR of 1941, fewer than 150,000 are paved, roughly 10%. When the rains come, the black clay soil absorbs the water and transforms into a viscous paste that swallows trucks up to their axles, immobilizes tanks, and turns marching on foot into an ordeal. The German advance, which in the first days of Operation Typhoon reached 40 to 50 kilometers per day, drops to 3 to 5 kilometers. In some sectors, to 0. Supply columns simply stop. Soldiers report scenes that seem pulled from nightmares. A soldier from the 7th Panzer Division writes in his diary, "The horses sink into the mud up to their bellies. The trucks spun all night without moving an inch. We needed 6 hours to cover 2 kilometers. The men carry ammunition and food on their backs because the vehicles cannot move. It seems the earth itself is fighting against us." Diary of an anonymous soldier of the 7th Panzer Division, October 1941, as reported in When Titans Clashed by David Glantz. The logistical problem is structural and predates the mud. The Soviet railway network operates on broad gauge, 1,524 millimeters, incompatible with the standard European gauge of 1,435 millimeters. Every kilometer of captured railway needs to be reconverted before it can be used. By October 1941, German trains can only reach Smolensk, still 400 kilometers from Moscow. All remaining supplies must travel by road in a logistical system that has been operating at its limit since July. Army Group Center requires a minimum of 27 supply trains per day to sustain its operations. In October, it receives an average of 8 to 10. The consequences are immediate. Lack of fuel for the tanks, lack of ammunition for the artillery, lack of food for the soldiers, lack of winter clothing for an army marching toward the most brutal cold on the European continent. Part 6. Moscow's Darkest Hour, Panic and Resistance. While the Germans fight the mud, Moscow lives through its moment of greatest danger. On October 15, 1941, Stalin orders the evacuation of the government, the diplomatic corps, and a large portion of the industrial apparatus to Kuybyshev, present-day Samara, on the Volga, 850 kilometers to the east. Panic grips the capital. On October 16th and 17th, in what will become known as the Bolshaya Panika, the Great Panic, hundreds of thousands of Muscovites try to flee eastward. Train stations are overrun by desperate crowds. Party officials burn documents. Looters break into abandoned shops and warehouses. Public order collapses. But Stalin, in a decision that defines his character and, perhaps, the fate of the war, remains in Moscow. It is a calculated and profoundly symbolic gesture. If the leader does not flee, the capital has not fallen. The NKVD receives brutal orders to restore order. Looters and deserters are summarily shot. Military field tribunals issue death sentences that are carried out within hours. A state of siege is declared on October 19th. And then something extraordinary begins. The city mobilizes with an intensity that transcends state coercion. More than 450,000 Moscow civilians, 3/4 of them women, are organized into labor battalions to build defensive lines. They dig anti-tank trenches, position barricades, install minefields. In total, 676 kilometers of anti-tank trenches are dug, 3,800 kilometers of barbed wire obstacles are built, and 37,500 defensive positions are installed, bunkers, machine gun emplacements, street barricades. All of this in weeks, under rain, cold, and the constant threat of aerial bombardment. A young woman worker from a Moscow factory, Valentina Krutova, remembers decades later, "My hands bled from digging the frozen earth. We had no proper gloves, but nobody complained. We knew that if Moscow fell, it would be the end of everything, not the government, everything, of us." That is Valentina Krutova in an interview for the Oral Archive of the Museum of the Great Patriotic War, 1985. Simultaneously, the Soviet industrial machine accomplishes one of the most impressive logistical feats of the 20th century. Between July and November 1941, the USSR dismantles and relocates more than 1,500 entire factories with their workers, machinery, and raw materials to the Urals, Western Siberia, and Central Asia. Factories that produce tractors in Stalingrad and Chelyabinsk are converted to produce T-34 tanks. Armament production not only survives, it grows. Part 7. Zhukov enters the stage. On October 10, 1941, a man arrives in Moscow who will change the course of the battle, General Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov. Zhukov is not an unknown name. In 1939, in distant Mongolia, he commanded the Soviet victory over the Japanese at Khalkhin Gol, a battle that, although little known in the West, brilliantly demonstrated the combined use of armor, artillery, and infantry. More recently, he had commanded the defense of Leningrad, stabilizing a desperate situation in September 1941. Now, Stalin summons him for the most crucial mission of all, to save Moscow. Zhukov is the opposite of the cowardly military bureaucrat that Stalin's purges had promoted. He is blunt, demanding, ruthless, and competent. Upon assuming command of the Western Front, reorganized to include what remained of the three previous fronts, he assesses the situation with cold eyes. The situation is grave, but not hopeless. The Germans are exhausted and stretched to the limit. Their supply lines are broken. Every kilometer they advance weakens them. We need to buy time, and then counterattack. That is Georgy Zhukov in a report to Stalin, October 1941, as reported in Zhukov by Otto Preston Cheney. Zhukov's strategy is a work of brutal pragmatism. He organizes a defense in depth along multiple concentric lines around Moscow. The first line of defense is 100 to 120 kilometers from the city. The second, 50 to 60. The third is Moscow itself, transformed into an urban fortress. Every village, every road junction, every hill is converted into a point of resistance. Mobile battle groups, agile combinations of T-34 tanks, motorized infantry, and ski troops are positioned for local counterattacks to prevent any penetration from turning into a breakthrough. And crucially, Zhukov is receiving reinforcements. The Siberian divisions, elite troops, trained for winter, equipped with thermal uniforms and weapons lubricated for extreme temperatures, begin to arrive. These are units freed by the intelligence of Richard Sorge, the Soviet spy in Tokyo, who had transmitted to Moscow the decisive information that Japan would attack the Allies in the Pacific and not the USSR through Siberia. Stalin, reluctant until the very last moment, finally authorizes the transfer of up to 18 divisions from the Far East. Part 8. The Final Effort, November 1941. On November 15th, the cold freezes the mud and the roads harden again. Army Group Center launches what it hopes will be the final assault on Moscow. It is round 2 of Operation Typhoon. To the north, the 3rd Panzer Group of General Georg Hans Reinhardt and the 4th Panzer Group of General Erich Hopner advance on both sides of the Moscow-Volga Canal. The 7th Panzer Division reaches Yakrima, just 60 kilometers north of Moscow, and even establishes a bridgehead on the other side of the canal. To the south, Guderian advances on Tula, a vital industrial city, attempting to encircle it to create a pincer with the forces from the north. But each kilometer of advance costs more than the one before. The panzer divisions, which in June had 150 to 200 tanks each, now operate with 30 to 50, sometimes fewer. The 6th Panzer Division, which began Barbarossa with 245 tanks, is reduced to 36. The 20th Panzer Division has only 27 operational tanks. The infantry is so exhausted and depleted that regiments of 3,000 men fight with effective strengths of 400 to 600. The cold, initially welcomed for hardening the roads, quickly becomes a deadly enemy. Temperatures plunge to minus 25 degrees Celsius, then minus 30, and on some November nights reach minus 40. Tank engines freeze overnight if they are not kept running, consuming the precious fuel that barely arrives through the shattered supply chain. Weapons jam. The recoil mechanisms of cannons freeze. Machine guns seize up. Even the bolts of Mauser K98K rifles need to be heated with fire before they will function. A medical officer of the 3rd Motorized Infantry Division records the humanitarian crisis descending upon the army. Frostbite cases arrive at the aid stations in a continuous stream. Toes, fingers, noses, the skin blackened, dead. Many men have no boots adequate for winter. They wear Russian boots stripped from the dead. Those who find none wrap straw around their feet. Today I saw a man whose both feet had to be amputated. He was 19 years old. That is from the diary of Dr. Heinrich Heipe, medical officer, 3rd Motorized Infantry Division, November 1941, Moscow tram stop. The contrast with the Soviet troops is devastating. The Siberian soldiers arrive with Valenki, lined felt boots, Ushanka, fur hats with ear flaps, Telegrika, padded jackets, and white camouflage uniforms. Their T-34 tanks, technologically superior to anything the Germans possess, run on diesel engines that withstand the cold better and have wide tracks that handle the snow more effectively. The German Panzer III and Panzer IV models, with their narrow tracks, sink into the snow while the T-34s glide over it. Part 9. Battle at the Gates, the 3 decisive operations. First, the Battle of Tula, October through December 1941. Tula, an industrial city 170 kilometers south of Moscow, is the key to the southern flank. Guderian needs to take it to complete the southern pincer around the capital, but Tula refuses to fall. The defense of the city is organized by the 50th Army under General Ivan Boldin, reinforced by workers' militias, laborers from Tula's armament factories who operate the weapons they themselves manufactured. The garrison is relatively small, but the city is transformed into a fortress. Barricades are erected on every main street. Anti-tank guns are positioned at key intersections. Tula's factories, which produce the famous Mosin Nagant rifles and Maxim machine guns, continue operating under bombardment. The workers labor in 12-hour shifts and then go to the trenches. Guderian launches repeated attacks with the 3rd Panzer Division and the 4th Panzer Division, supported by the Grossdeutschland Motorized Infantry Division. The German tanks managed to partially bypass the city to the east, cutting some of the highways leading to Moscow. But they never managed to take Tula itself. The city's obstinate defense prevents Guderian from closing the southern pincer, leaving a dangerous open flank in his lines. Second, the Battle of Klein and the advance to the Moscow. Volga Canal, November 1941. North of Moscow, Reinhardt's 3rd Panzer Group achieves the deepest German advance of the entire campaign. The 7th Panzer Division, the Ghost Division, once commanded by Erwin Rommel, captures the city of Klin on November 23rd and advances to Yakrima, where the division's motorcycle battalion crosses the frozen Moscow-Volga Canal. It is the moment of greatest danger for Moscow. If the Germans can expand the bridgehead and bring armored forces to the other side of the canal, they could advance on Moscow from the northeast, where the defenses are weakest. But the 1st Shock Brigade, freshly arrived from the reserves, launches an immediate counterattack. The bridgehead is eliminated on November 29th. The Germans are pushed back to the western side of the canal. It was the closest to Moscow that any German unit would reach in the war, and the moment the tide begins to turn. Third, the battle for the Naro-Fominsk sector, December 1941. In the central sector, the Minsk-Moscow highway, the most direct route to the capital, is defended by the 33rd Rifle Division and units of the 5th Guards Rifle Division. On December 1st, elements of the German 258th Infantry Division and the 292nd Infantry Division attempt a final advance along the highway, reaching the village of Burtsevo, just 27 kilometers from the municipal boundary of Moscow. It is the closest point. The German soldiers report that they can see, on the frozen horizon, the towers of Moscow. but they are exhausted, freezing, and operating at 40% of normal strength. Soviet counterattacks, carried out by motorized reconnaissance forces and ski infantry, are relentless, 24 hours a day. Every gain of ground is contested meter by meter. The advance grinds to a halt. On December 4th, Bach and Cluj agree. Army Group Center no longer has the strength to attack. The offensive on Moscow is suspended. But the war on this front is far from over. Part 10. The Soviet Counteroffensive, The Bear Awakens. It is December 5th, 1941, a day that deserves a place among the most important dates of the 20th century. Zhukov gives the order. The Soviet counteroffensive deploys 1,100,000 soldiers organized into three fronts. The Kalinin Front under General Ivan Konev to the north, Zhukov's Western Front in the center, and the Southwestern Front under General Semyon Timoshenko to the south. They are supported by 774 tanks, a number inferior to the 1,000 of the Wehrmacht at the start of Operation Typhoon, but the majority are the formidable T-34s and the heavy KV-1s, 1,370 aircraft, and more than 7,600 artillery pieces and mortars. The attack strikes the German lines like an earthquake. The Siberian divisions, the 78th Rifle Division, the 32nd Rifle Division, the 82nd Motorized Ski Rifle Division, and dozens of others attack in white camouflage uniforms over the snow, often without artillery preparation to maintain the element of surprise. They use skis, sleds, and horses adapted to winter, primitive means of transport but perfectly suited to the conditions. Against them, the German soldiers, many still wearing the same summer uniforms they had on when they crossed the border in June, cannot even hold their weapons without their fingers freezing to the metal. The surprise is nearly total. German intelligence, the Fremde Heere Ost, or Foreign Armies East, commanded by then Colonel Reinhard Gehlen, had drastically underestimated Soviet reserves. Gehlen estimated that the Red Army had perhaps 50 reserve divisions across the entire country. In reality, Stalin had concentrated at least 77 new divisions for the Moscow counteroffensive, many of them secretly transferred from Siberia, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. The results are dramatic. In the Klin sector, the 30th Soviet Army and the 1st Shock Brigade retake the city on December 15th after brutal house-to-house fighting. Guderian, to the south, is forced to abandon all positions conquered around Tula and retreat more than 100 kilometers. In the central sector, the Germans are pushed back to the Rzhev-Vyazma line, 150 to 250 kilometers from Moscow. The crisis is so severe that Hitler makes a radical decision. On December 19th, he dismisses Field Marshal Walther von Brauchitsch, commander-in-chief of the army, and personally assumes command of all ground operations. In the following weeks, he dismisses or accepts the resignation of Bach, Guderian, Hopner, Strauss, and dozens of other generals. It is a purge that mutilates the Wehrmacht's officer corps and replaces professional experience with ideological obedience. Hitler's order is simple and unyielding. No retreat, fight to the last man, do not yield a single meter. That is the so-called Haltebefehl, or halt order. It is an order that, ironically, probably saves Army Group Center from total collapse. A general retreat under winter conditions, without adequate roads and with heavy equipment abandoned, could have turned into a catastrophic rout, a repetition of Napoleon's disaster of 1812. But the human cost is horrific. Part 11. The White Hell, the Soldier's Experience. For the soldiers on both sides, the Battle of Moscow is a descent into frozen hell. The Germans. The average German soldier on the Moscow front in December 1941 lives an existence that defies imagination. He wears a field coat, a Feldmantel, designed for the European autumn, not for the Russian winter. There are no thermal garments in sufficient quantity. The Wehrmacht, planning for an 8-week war, simply did not order them in time. The Wohlsammlung, the wool collection campaign organized in Germany in December, is a humiliating gesture that reveals to the German people, for the first time, that something has gone terribly wrong in the East. Medical conditions are medieval. Frostbite, or Frierung, becomes as prevalent as combat wounds. The Wehrmacht records more than 100,000 cases of severe frostbite during the winter of 1941 to 42, many resulting in amputations. Dysentery, typhus, and other diseases decimate the ranks as much as the fighting. A soldier of the 98th Infantry Division writes home, "You ask me how we are. We are alive, for now. 3 of us sleep together, pressed close, so we don't freeze during the night. In the morning, we have to check whether someone died during the night. It has already happened twice in my platoon. The food arrives frozen, when it arrives at all. We eat snow to quench our thirst. The Russians attack every night. They move like ghosts in the snow. I can no longer feel my feet." That letter, from a soldier of the 98th Infantry Division, December 1941, comes from the Feldpost archive of the Military Museum of Dresden. The Soviets. The Soviet experience is no less brutal, but it is tempered by something the Germans do not possess: the certainty that they are fighting for the survival of their homeland. Red Army soldiers suffer their own deprivations. Many reserve divisions arrive at the front with insufficient training, and casualties among the new units are staggering. It is common for reinforcement battalions to lose 30 to 50% of their strength in the first 2 days of combat. But morale is sustained by a complex mixture of genuine patriotism, fear of punishment, the Strafbat or penal battalions, and the Zagraditelny Otriadi or blocking detachments are brutal realities and an atavistic determination not to surrender the homeland to the invader. The Soviet concept of Rodina, the motherland, assumes an almost sacred meaning. Soviet fighters also demonstrate a capacity for improvisation that the Germans, bound to a more rigid doctrine, frequently cannot match. Ski units cover 60 to 80 kilometers per night to attack German rear positions, destroy supply depots, and ambush resupply columns. Partisan groups, armed civilians operating behind enemy lines, multiply, attacking railways, bridges, and command posts. Part 12. The Cost, Statistics of Horror. The Battle of Moscow, in its broadest sense, from Operation Typhoon on October 2, 1941, to the end of the Soviet counteroffensive on January 7, 1942, with some periodizations extending to April 20, 1942, is one of the bloodiest battles in history. Soviet casualties, October 1941 through January 1942, break down as follows. Killed and missing, approximately 514,338. Wounded and sick, approximately 143,941. Prisoners, more than 600,000, primarily in the Vyazma and Bryansk cauldrons in October. Total irrecoverable and medical casualties, more than 1 million men during the defensive phase. Material losses, 2,785 tanks, 3,832 artillery pieces, 293 aircraft. If we include the counteroffensive phase, December 1941 through April 1942, the additional Soviet losses are as follows. Killed and missing, approximately 139,586. Wounded and sick, approximately 231,369. German casualties, October 1941 through March 1942, break down as follows. Killed, wounded, and missing, approximately 248,000 in Army Group Center during the offensive phase, October through December. Additional casualties during the Soviet counteroffensive are estimated at 55,000 to 100,000 more. Material losses include hundreds of tanks, thousands of motorized vehicles, and enormous quantities of heavy artillery that could not be withdrawn during the retreats. Frostbite cases number more than 100,000, many resulting in permanent disability. Deaths from disease and exhaustion add tens of thousands more. Impact on civilians. The German occupation of the regions around Moscow, though brief, October through December, leaves terrible marks. Entire villages are destroyed in reprisals against partisan activities. Einsatzgruppe B, following Army Group Center, carries out mass executions of Jews, political commissars, and suspected partisans. Retreating soldiers, following the scorched earth policy, Verbrannte Erde, set fire to homes, barns, and installations, frequently leaving the civilian population without shelter in the depths of winter. tens of thousands of civilians die from hunger, cold, and violence during and after the battle. Part 13. Why the Germans lost, the deeper causes. The German defeat before Moscow was not the work of a single factor. It was a constellation of errors, underestimations, and structural realities that, combined, made German victory impossible even without taking the winter into account. First, the fundamental strategic underestimation. The deepest cause of the defeat lies in the premise that underpinned all of Operation Barbarossa, the belief that the USSR was a fragile colossus that would crumble after the first blows. German planning was based on the idea of an 8-week war and envisioned no scenario for a prolonged campaign. There was no logistical preparation for a winter at the front, no industrial planning to replace equipment losses, and no strategy for dealing with Russia's strategic depth, a country that stretched for 10,000 kilometers, from the Baltic to the Pacific. Second, the diversion to Kiev. Hitler's decision to divert the 2nd Panzer Group southward in August 1941 cost Army Group Center 5 precious weeks, exactly the time that would have been needed to reach and take Moscow before the autumn Rasputitsa. Although Kiev was a spectacular tactical victory, it was a strategic error that fragmented the main effort and dispersed forces that Germany could not afford to disperse. Third, the logistical collapse. The Wehrmacht of 1941 was, paradoxically, a military force of mixed technology. Its panzers were cutting edge, but the bulk of its transport depended on horses. More than 750,000 horses were employed in Operation Barbarossa. The German logistical system was simply not designed to sustain operations 1,500 kilometers from its starting bases, in a country with precarious and incompatible road and rail infrastructure. Even without the mud and the cold, the supply lines were already breaking. Fourth, the winter, but not in the way we think. Yes, the cold was devastating, but the myth that the winter defeated the Germans is simplistic and unfair to the Soviet sacrifice. The Russians also fought in the same cold. The difference is that they were prepared, not only in terms of equipment, but in terms of doctrine, experience, and determination. Winter was a force multiplier for the Soviets and a weakness multiplier for the Germans, but it was not the primary cause of the defeat. The cause was the failure to win before winter, and that failure has roots in strategic decisions, not in weather conditions. Fifth, Soviet resilience. Perhaps the most underestimated factor by German planners. The capacity of the USSR to absorb catastrophic losses, more than 1 million casualties, hundreds of thousands of prisoners, immense territorial losses, and still continue fighting, was something unprecedented in European military history. The industrial transfer to the east, the mobilization of Siberian reserves, the construction of Moscow's defenses by hundreds of thousands of civilians, all of this reflected a combination of relentless state authoritarianism, genuine patriotism, and the correct perception that the alternative to resistance was annihilation. Sixth, leadership. Zhukov versus the fragmented German command. Zhukov proved to be the right man at the right moment. His ability to organize a defense with scarce resources, to identify the exact moment for the counteroffensive, and to execute it with precision and brutality was decisive. On the German side, the chain of command was fractured by Hitler's constant interventions as he progressively replaced the professional judgment of his generals with his own intuitions, frequently brilliant at the political level, but increasingly disastrous at the operational level. Part 14. Controversies and historiographical debates. The Battle of Moscow remains a historiographical battlefield almost as contested as the military one. The diversion to Kiev debate. The General's Orthodoxy School, based on the memoirs of Guderian, Manstein, Halder, and other commanders who survived the war, blames Hitler for the failure, arguing that a direct attack on Moscow in August would have succeeded. This view dominated Western historiography for decades, but more recent historians, such as David Stahel in his work Operation Barbarossa and Germany's Defeat in the East, argue that the German supply lines were already so weakened by August that an attack on Moscow that month would probably have failed just the same, or produced a Pyrrhic victory impossible to sustain. Hitler's halt order. The Halta Befehl of December 1941 generated fierce debate. Generals such as Guderian and Hoepner argued that an orderly retreat to defensible positions further west would have been strategically wise. Hitler, and some historians who supported him, such as Percy Ernst Schramm, argued that the no-retreat order prevented a general rout. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. The Halta Befehl prevented a total collapse, but also caused unnecessary casualties by prohibiting local tactical adjustments. The role of General Winter. The climatic explanation, comfortable for German veterans and their apologists, has been progressively challenged by Soviet historiography and, more recently, by Western historians such as David Glantz in When Titans Clashed and Evan Maudsley in Thunder in the East. These authors demonstrate that the cold affected both sides and that the Soviet advantage resided primarily in preparation, strategic reserves, and competent leadership, not in mere geography. The underestimation of Soviet industrial capacity. The German planners and OKH intelligence committed a monumental error of assessment by underestimating Soviet industrial capacity. The USSR produced 6,590 tanks in 1941, despite losing 20,500 and 24,446 aircraft, despite losing 21,200. The Soviet replacement capacity far exceeded German estimates and meant that every German battle of annihilation was, in reality, a temporary victory. The destroyed divisions were replaced within weeks. Part 15. The Legacy. The Point of No Return. The Battle of Moscow did not decide the Second World War. For that, Stalingrad, Kursk, D-Day, and the long march to Berlin would still be necessary. But it decided something equally fundamental. It demonstrated that Nazi Germany could be defeated. Until December 1941, the Wehrmacht was undefeated. It had conquered Poland in 4 weeks, France in 6, the Balkans in 3. The idea that this army could be not merely halted but pushed back seemed inconceivable. Moscow destroyed that myth. For Germany, the defeat at Moscow meant the end of Blitzkrieg as a war strategy. From 1942 onward, the Reich would find itself trapped in exactly the kind of war it most feared, a prolonged war of attrition against a coalition with vastly superior human, industrial, and material resources. Germany produced 5,200 tanks in 1942, the USSR 24,668. Germany had 80 million inhabitants. The USSR alone had 196 million. Not counting the British Empire and the United States. For the USSR, Moscow was the first chapter of an epic that would cost 27 million Soviet lives, the most horrific price paid by any nation in history. But it was also the founding moment of a narrative of resistance and sacrifice that would define Russian national identity for generations. The Battle of Moscow, alongside Stalingrad and Leningrad, became one of the sacred pillars of Russian collective memory, an event that transcends history to inhabit the territory of national myth. For the world, Moscow mattered because it changed the equation of the war. When Zhukov's counteroffensive strikes the Germans in December 1941, America has just entered the war. Pearl Harbor falls on December 7th, 2 days after the start of the Soviet counteroffensive. The temporal coincidence is not irrelevant. The certainty that the USSR will survive and will continue fighting fundamentally alters the Allies' strategic calculations. Roosevelt can now commit to the Europe First strategy, knowing that the Soviets will keep the majority of German forces occupied in the East. Part 16. Epilogue. The Ghosts in the Snow. In the spring of 1942, when the snow melts in the fields around Moscow, the bodies emerge, German, Soviet, civilian. There are hundreds of thousands. Many will never be identified. The villages destroyed by the scorched earth policy are rebuilt, brick by brick, by the same women who dug the trenches. The soldier who wrote that he could no longer feel his feet never returned home. His diary was found on his body, frozen in a trench 80 kilometers from Moscow. Valentina Krutova, the young woman who dug trenches with her hands bleeding, survived the war. She lived until 2003. She never left Moscow. Georgy Zhukov became the most celebrated military commander of the war, leading Soviet forces from Moscow to Berlin. He died in 1974, covered in medals, but politically marginalized, like so many Soviet heroes, too great for the system that created him. Heinz Guderian, dismissed by Hitler after the defeat at Moscow, was recalled in 1943. He survived the war and wrote his memoirs, Panzerleader, in which, with self-serving elegance, he blamed Hitler, the cold, and the mud for everything except his own decisions. The Battle of Moscow is one of those crossroads of history where the fate of the world is decided not in conference halls, but in frozen trenches, in factories working by candlelight, in the bleeding hands of women digging earth as hard as stone. It is the moment when the greatest war machine in the world hurls itself against the greatest expanse of territory, the greatest reservoir of human resistance, and discovers, too late, that there are forces more powerful than steel and speed. The mud, the ice, the distance, the will, all conspired against the invaders. But above all, it was the decision of millions of human beings not to yield that stopped the panzers at the gates of Moscow. The war would continue for another 3.5 years. It would cost tens of millions more lives. But in that December of 1941, on the snowy steppes of central Russia, something had changed forever. The Blitzkrieg had found its limit, and that limit was human. The battle for Moscow was the turning point of the entire war. From then on, the Germans never again held the strategic initiative in the East. The war became a question of time, and time was fighting against them. Those are the words of David Glantz from When Titans Clashed, How the Red Army Stopped Hitler.